He is to welcome Mr. Hazem. He is from Tunisia, so he will be the technical trainer in this course. He will do this or overlap with Mr. Safadi in this course. Hopefully you will join and enjoy this course with Hazem. He can speak or he can understand Arabic very well, but he prefers to talk in English. يعطيكم العافية جميعا. إسراء موسى مدير مشروع جو ديجيتال. اليوم أول التدريبات الأونلاين حتكون مع مستر حازم، هو من تونس وعنده تكنيكال اكسبيرينس كتير منيحة. راح يكون معاكم خلال الفترة الجاي بالتزامن مع مستر الصفدي. أول التدريبات حتكون اليوم وبكرة وكمان الأسبوع الجاي السبت والأحد بنفس المواعيد هاي. طبعا التواصل والليكتشر كلها راح تكون بالإنجليش، بس in case of يعني في شغلات معينة ما قدرتوا تعبروا عنها بالإنجليش ممكن تستخدموا العربي، بس من طرفه هو راح يحكي معاكم إنجليش. شغلات ثانية بالنسبة لشروط التواصل، هنا إحنا حنكون جروب اوف 80 أكثر من 80 شخص، فبدنا نحترم بعض الرولز والقواعد اللي حتكون كنا لازم نلتزم فيها. أول شيء كلنا بدنا نكون مسميين حالنا بالاسمنا، يعني من غير أي نيك نيمز ومن غير أي أشياء ثانية. الكل يحاول يحط صورته الشخصية عشان نتعرف على بعض. يمكن أنتم بتعرفوا بعض بس المهندس حازم بعيد عنكم، فيعني عشان كمان يعرفكم يصير التواصل أسهل. كنا نكون ميوتد، ما نفتح المايك إلا إذا أخذنا permission ورفعنا إيدنا وأعطانا البرميشن مستر حازم إنه نحكي في هاي السيشن. السيشنز راح تكون ريكوردد بس ما بدنا نعتمد عليها، الحضور إجباري وراح يصير في متابعة لكم ولحضوركم ولمشاركتكم day by day. بخصوص الخطة ما بعد الأسبوعين هدول راح نوفيكم فيها بالضبط وكيف راح تصير عملية التقسيم لتو جروبس، رياكت نيتيف ورياكت دوت جي اس. أي تفاصيل ثانية حابين تسألوا عنها قبل لا أروح؟ It's my pleasure to answer.
هاي السلام عليكم. شكرا إسراء على المقدمة. So yeah, my name is Hazem. I'm from Tunisia. I have been writing code for the last 10 years actually, and I am the CTO and co-founder of Katomi, a tech startup specialized in e-health that is currently working in Tunisia and in Europe as well. And all of our stack is written in JavaScript, which will be the object of our lessons this week and next week. We will build on what you already have started with Mr. Safadi before we move on to the React framework, and for those who are specialized in the web with the server side JavaScript. And for those who are going to the mobile course, we will go with hybrid JavaScript development for mobile using React Native. So we will start the lesson at this point. I will expose you the lesson plan. We will go through learning what is the Crude acronym. We will send and receive data in the form of form data, the form data API from the browser. We will explore what are JSONs, and we will also go through the data binding concept, and we'll leave some time at the end of it for questions and answers regarding everything we did. So for sending form data and data binding, we'll also have a live coding session where I will write the code to show you in practice what it means. I will also share at the end of the lesson all the code that has been written. I'm also currently recording this lesson, and I will send you the video as well. So you'll have everything you need to review it if needed. We'll have, before we move on, I'd like to clarify that tomorrow we'll have a continuation of this lesson. At the end of it, we'll have an assignment that you can work on next week. So let's start. What are Crude operations? The Crude is an acronym for create, read, update, and delete, which are the most basic operations that you can use in terms of communicating with an application, sending data, getting data, updating the data, and deleting it. Most of the time, it's going to be when communicating with a database. And nowadays, that constitutes most of what we do, since the value of data is getting higher and higher. And most of what you'll do in terms of projects will be in a way or another, basically adding data, reading it, updating it, and deleting it if needed. For example, you're doing that every day, for example, on your phones, when you're creating new contacts, when you read the contacts information, when you're updating an old contacts number, or you delete old contacts. We've done that earlier as well on WhatsApp. For example, every message on WhatsApp, basically when you send it, you're going to send to a WhatsApp server a create operation. And when you're reading someone else's messages, you're going to read it. And of course, you can also delete your old messages on WhatsApp, but you get my point. How is that done? Basically, you started there, you had a lesson with Mr. Safadi explaining what HTTP is. We are going to, it's going to build on that. Basically, we are going to send the requests to our server using HTTP requests with the correct method header that will indicate to our server what are we trying to do. So we'll send an HTTP post, for example, with the post method, if we'd like to create something new, if that's what we're trying to do. We're going to send a put method if we are trying to update something, and we'll be in the same sense, we'll have the get and delete methods as well in terms of HTTP to describe these operations that we're trying to do. What we need to understand as well is that everything we do is we'll have to go through our web browser. We are connected to our web browser. The web browser is going to run our JavaScript code, which is considered a client in a client-server relationship. Every client-server relationship will be based on two things: requests and responses. We'll send an HTTP request, and we'll get a response in exchange. If we're trying to add something, we might receive, for example, a code indicating that we are successful. We might receive a code that says we have failed because maybe we have missing data. Let's say, for example, we are trying to add a new contact and we didn't put in the phone number, and our server will return to us an error saying, hey, you are missing the phone number. You need to put it so I can add it to the database. And that code, the server, how it understands and how it will behave with the database, is also going to be run through code. And for those who will follow the advanced web course specialization, we'll also go through JavaScript code on the server using Node.js that will interpret these requests that we are going to be developing on the client side. And we'll also be talking about databases as well, because the server has to put the data somewhere, right? So sending form data. What is actually form data? Form data is an API or interface that is provided by our web browser. Basically, if you're using Google Chrome, Firefox, etc., it will have this API ready for you to use, which will allow you to construct a set of key value pairs to describe your data. For example, an example of that would be a first name would be the key, and Hazm would be the value in this case. And I'd have another key pair for my last name. Like last name would be the key, and Miri would be the value. And these will be represented in an encoded way that is called a form data on our browser. And when we need to send this, like we discussed, to our server, we will need to add another header. We talked about headers, like, for example, when we want to put in the method so the server understands what we're trying to do. We'll also need to add a header explaining what is the format of what we're sending it. And we'll put in a header called multi-part form data, which is something we will touch on in more detail as lessons go on. An example of how you can create a form data in JavaScript is basically through a variable. You've learned about variables with Mr. Safadi. We'll declare a new variable called form data, and we'll initialize this constructor of form data, new form data. Then we can append whatever information we want to it. We can have form data.append. The key here is username, and Chris would be the value in this case, like we discussed earlier. So how do we exactly send that data to our server? In this example, later on when we will code, we will use the get method, which means that we will put the data in the URL. For example, we're going to basically be writing the key and pair values and adding them at the end of the page address. For example, when you go to YouTube and you want to watch a video, if you look at the URL, you will notice that after youtube.com, you have an interrogation mark that which indicates to the browser that it is getting form data, URL encoded form data. In the case of YouTube, for example, in this example you see here, V indicates the video ID. It will indicate to YouTube basically which video you want to read from the million of videos available. You might notice there is also an end symbol, indicates that we have another key pair value, and this time the key would be T, which basically indicates time, and will tell YouTube, for example, if you want the video to start not at the beginning, but rather 82 seconds later, because you want, for example, if you're sharing it with a friend and you want them to see the video from a definite starting point, that's what you will be doing to get it starting from the point you want it to be. In practice, what does that mean? We'll be writing a short code working with form data. So I'll be lowering the presentation for now, and I'll be going to a nice website that is called actually Code Sandbox, and that will allow me to write on the web whatever I need to do, right, to run a basic web code without having to have an editor and open it on the browser, etc. Please tell me in the chat if you are seeing my screen and seeing Code Sandbox properly before we move on. Okay, good. So let's start a new sandbox. We'll start a new sandbox here, and we'll write a static HTML. We'll start with a basic HTML5 template, which will basically give us this. We'll see our code here, and which is great with Code Sandbox, is that we will see results in real time at our right. So let's get started. We'll get rid of the code we are not using right now and keep an empty HTML5 file. So what we'll start with is actually quite simple. What we'll start doing is what we need here, we need to declare, we're going to see what are forms in terms of HTML. So we'll declare a new form. A new form here. This is how we can do it. What we will do then is we need to create inputs to get the data. We're going to have an input, for example, with the type text. You can have multiple types and inputs in HTML. I believe you went through that when first working with Mr. Safari. Will indicate the ID and the name of this. When we put the name here, it will be the key in our key value pairs. So here we have our input. we can see our input being displayed here. We'll also add a label for our input. We'll see it's a label that for first name, and we'll just write it is the first name. That will give us this input. We'll add the same thing for the last name. There we go. So now what do we do with this data? I can write here, I can write Mary, but it does nothing. We want to get the data out of this form. So what we'll do is first we'll have to add a new input of type submit, which will send basically our data. And you'll see we now have a button to send the data, but we need to also define what kind of what is the action we want to be done. Like I said, so we'll do the method get, which basically will use the URL encoded method that we discussed earlier. It will put in the URL the interrogation mark, the first name equal equal Hazem, last name equal last name, depending on what we have written. But now we need to tell it where to send it. Do we send it to our server, or where do we send it exactly? We're going to send, as of now, since we don't have a server, we'll be sending it to a new file that we'll call data.html. And we'll create here a new file that we'll call data.html. All right, and we'll have here, hello world. So let's get back. So it should send us to data.html page and send the data that we've written in our form in terms of URL encoded data, because we put in the method get. If we would have put the method as post, it would send it as in a different way that will get more in detail when we'll be working with servers. For now, we have to use get because we are staying on the client side. So let's write something here and submit. Here, it redirected us to our new page. It is good, but all we see right now is hello world. We want to be getting the data we have written, right? So this is not enough. We need to get back to our data and figure out a way to display the data that we have received here. Well, how do we do that? We do that by basically going to our data here, and we'll put in a new div that will need to put the information in. We'll put it empty because we don't know here what the information is going to be. We'll give it an ID that we'll call data display, for example. And we'll add a script here to data.js, and we'll start working with JavaScript to get the data that we want. So how will it work? Let's start here. We'll start with data. We declare the data. It is going to be an empty object for now. And I'm sorry, I had a bit of my computer froze a bit. So what we need to do now is we'll need to have data to display. Let's start with the dummy data. Data display HTML, and we'll display H2 your data. You'll notice that I'm writing HTML here. And what we'll do then is that we will create a function that we'll call display data. And it will take no parameters. And what we'll do here is that basically we will say that if we found it seems I have forgotten something. So I'll have here, we have forgotten something, that here we need to find the div we created previously. Here we need to find this so we can put our data inside. So we'll have the data display element, and we'll use document.getElementById to get that element when given the ID that we've given, which is data display. Now what we'll say here is that if we find our element, please, then we'll do data display element dot inner HTML equal our data display HTML. And we'll execute our display data on launch. Let's see. Let's send it some data. Let's test it. And we'll see that it displays your data that we have in the HTML here. So now what I want to do is that I want to add to this data display HTML the data that I've received. So how can we do that? As I said, we have here, we are receiving the data in this format. We have the URL, we have here, we'll have data.html, first name equal Hazm or something else, and last name equal here. That's basically what we'll be getting. So how can I read that from the URL? The browser gives us a good option to do that. Basically, we can access it through the window location.search. Let's look here. We can have our search, we can have it through window.location.search. And let's console.log this so we can see its content. And if we can work with it. So let's try again. Let's write anything and go to the next page. We'll see a new something on our console, and we can see we are getting the data correctly. We're getting the string that we sent. Like I said, the URL encoded from data. So the URL from data is here. We have received it successfully, but it's not usable as it is. We need to turn it into HTML. We need to separate everything. We need to have first name alone, the last name alone, so we can manipulate it. Which is good that we have a good way from the browser to do that as well, which is called the URL search params. So we'll have URL search params, and what we will need to do is create a new URL search params, and we'll give the constructor our search text. Let's see what we have here. Let's console.log it so we can see what it is giving us and how we can work with it going forward. Let's start again. Let's refresh so we can clean our console. and let's send anything. Let's say not fit. And we'll see here on our console, the URL search params is a full object, and it has multiple functions. What the function we'll be using here is entries, which is a function that will give us all the entries it has found. So what we'll do now is that we will have data here. The data that we declared here on top will be injecting everything there. So we'll do data equal object dot entries dot from entries, because like we've seen here in the console, we have the entries in our URL search params. So we'll be creating a new object from entries, and we'll give it our URL search params dot entries function. Let's see what we have now. Let's see if our data is correct. Let's try again. And we'll see here our data is an object which has the first name, Abdul Sattar, last name only. So we have everything we need to now. So we can now start constructing our basically our HTML. So let's do that. What we will do is we will have object dot entries of data that creates for us an array of key and value pairs, and we'll have to for each it, and each entry is gonna give us a pair like we discussed earlier, like it is in the URL. So we'll have here the key, which is going to be the first element in our pair, and we'll have the value, which is going to be the second element in our pair. So now we'll be adding this to our data display HTML. We'll add this here. And what we'll do is that we will give it another text, and we'll be doing this. Basically, what we'll do is that we'll create a new paragraph each time for every pair that we receive. So we'll be doing this for first name, and we'll be doing it again for last name. And what we'll do here is that we will create this pair, and we'll say, I want you to display the key, and in front of the key, I want it to be equal and value, so I can see my data correctly. So we should have everything we need here. Let's try it out. Let's write here my name. Let's write and see if it displays our data correctly. There, our data is correctly displayed. So in summary, what we did is that we created form data from this page, from our first page, directly from the HTML. We didn't have to write JavaScript code to write the form data. We took this form, we told it to send the data and the URL to our second page, it's called data.html. We went to data.html, where we declared a div where we would be injecting our data. And then we went here and we wrote a function that took the data in the URL and injected it in that div. So at this point, does anyone have any question regarding what we wrote until now? We can raise your hands to ask the questions. Is there anything you want me to clarify? Everything is clear until now? All right. So let's, if everything is clear, let's continue then. Okay. Now that we've took the form data from directly from the HTML, we discussed earlier the possibility for us to get that data in the JavaScript directly. How do we do that exactly now? I'd like for us to extend this example and add to it a way to send form data without the HTML form. So let's get back to our index.html. I want to be adding a second part to it that we'll use to basically send this data without going through a form. So let me get out of the form. We'll have a separator here so we can see them separately. All right. We'll have, let's create a button that we'll use for executing our function. Let's say let's create a button. So let's, what we want to do is that I want to create a button here. And when I click on it, I wanted to send a form data to another page that contains what time it is right now. I wanted to give me the time. So every time I click on the button, I want the time to be different, and I want it to tell me. So let's create a button that will, which will give the ID time sender. All right. And what we'll do now, and we'll put here, what time is it? So now we have this button that does nothing for now. We'll want to add functionality to it. So what we'll do is that we'll come here and we'll add a script that we'll call a JavaScript script, and we'll go create this file, index.js. All right. And what we'll want to do is we want to create a function here that we'll call send current time, that will be responsible for creating and sending my form data to the second page. We'll say for now it does nothing. It just tells to the console, hello world. And what we'd want to do is we'd like to go take our button. So we'll use document.getElement by ID. We'll use the ID button, time sender, excuse me, the ID we've given to the button. And we'll add an event listener to it. I believe you went through event listeners with Mr. Safedi. Basically, there are ways to add to your HTML elements some events to listen to. Like, for example, if you want something to happen when a button is clicked, you'll have to add an event listener with the click property. If you want something to happen when I hover on the button, when the mouse is just on the button without clicking, I'd use hover. There are a multitude of options that we can send. We can send the full screen change, as you can see here, full screen error, animation cancel. There are so many events we can listen to. But for now, all we need is to listen to the click on the button. And we want every time that it clicks, we want to execute our send current time function. All right. Let's try this out. Every time I click here, I should be getting on the console, hello world. So we see it is working. Now what I need to do is I need to change my function code so that it creates a form data and it sends it to my other page. All right. So that's what I'm going to do. What we're going to start, like we said on the presentation, we're going to start by creating our form data. We'll be doing form data equal new form data. This is a constructor. So now we have our form data. And what we need to do is that we need to take the current date value because we want to display time. So we create the current date value and we'll do new date. This is the browser API that gives us the actual date at the time of the execution of this function. This contains the date and hours. So I want to take only the time out of it. So what we'll do is that we'll create another object here that will create another concept that we'll call hours, and where we will have current date value dot get hours. This will give us a number with the hours, but I want to expand on this. For example, if it is 9 a.m., it will give me only 9 without the 0. So I wanted to add the 0 at the end. If it is only one character in the numbers, I wanted to add a 0 before it. So what I'll do is that I'll turn it into a string. So my number now becomes a text, and I'll use the function pad start. Make the interface bigger. Okay. I will try to make the interface bigger right now. Just give me a second. I will try to make it bigger. Let's say maybe I can zoom. Yeah. I guess is that any better? Do you have a better time reading now in the chat? Good.
It's good.
Good. So let's continue from here. All right. Now that we've gotten the hours, we were writing the pad start. So we can give it a pad start of 2. We want it to be 2 characters, and we need to fill the missing characters with a 0. All right, we'll be doing the same thing for the minutes. And we'll use the function get minutes instead of get hours, of course. So now we want to add to our form data, like we said in the presentation, we want to add something new. So we'll create append. We'll use the append function, which will take the key first. What will give the key time? We'll say we want to call it time, and we'll need to give it a value. So the value here will give it a string, and we'll say we wanted to display the hours, 2 points, and the minutes. So now let's see what we've got. Let's say let's log what we've done so far. We'll have form data entries, and this will show us our form data dot entries. Let's look at what we have. All right, let's click at what time is it, and you will see it gives me an object with the name. Oh, we don't have the actual data. Excuse me, I'll need to spread it here. That's the way to actually convert our form data to something that we can read ourselves. So we'll have one array, and this array has basically another array with the key and the value. We still have time, 12:45, because that's the time in Tunis. So we have 2 hours less than you guys, so that's my time. So we have it correctly. So we'll know here that I have my entries, and we know that it's going to be like this. Look at the chat. Okay, everything seems fine. All right. My entries. Now, what do we do with these entries? We need to send it to our other, we need to do two things. We need to encode it in the URL. Like we said, we need it to be URL encoded. And then we need to send it to our other page. So let's get started with our encoding. So what we'll do is that we want it to be a string file. So we'll have form data as a string. And we'll take our previous entries, like we said, it's an array. And we'll say that I'll be taking that array and I'll map it. Map is a function in arrays that allows us to do something with everything in the array and return a new array. Let me give you an example of that before we go forward with this. For example, let's say I have this array of 1, 2, and 5. Let's say I want a new array with the same data in the other array, but I wanted to increase every element by 2. I'll be doing this map value, and I'll be returning the value plus 2. So that what that will do, let me console log it here. What that will do is basically it will create a new array from the old array, giving plus 2 to every value. So let's try it out. New array, you can see here, it has become 3, 4, and 7 from 1 to 5. So that's basically what the map function does in arrays. It will basically create a new array from an old one. So we'll be using this to go through our entries array that we've seen, and we'll need to change it and to create a string of it. So we're going to encode it manually, unlike what happened earlier when the browser did it for us when we put the form in the HTML. So we'll have every map will give us a pair. Like we've seen earlier, it gives us the key and the value. So we'll be doing constant key will be the first element in the pair. Our value will be the second one in the pair. So that will be our keys and values. And what we'll want to do is that we'll want to encode each one. So we'll have encoded key. Why do we encode the key? Where we do encode everything? Let's say, let me explain this. Let's say we have a key that is formatted in a way that the browser doesn't like. Let's say we have, or a value, let's say we have it like this. Let's say you have the key, first name is Muhammad Ali. The browser doesn't like that space. If you go into the browser and type a space in the URL, the browser will won't know what to do with that space because it doesn't accept spaces in the URL. So that's why we need to encode it. If you try and look at how it would send from a form, you'll see that every space is replaced by a %20 in the URL. That's how the browser encodes spaces. So for every special character that it doesn't like, we need to find the correct replacement and put it. Hopefully we don't need to have to learn them all and know them all and do it manually, because the browser gives us a function to encode this. So we'll make sure that every value is encoded correctly. we'll have a new a new encoded key, which will be encode. We'll use the function, like I said, from the browser, which gives us an encode URI component function, which simply takes as a property the string that we want to encode. So we'll be encoding key. We'll do the exact same thing for our value. So we'll have an encoded value here with our value. And now we should be having, let's try it out. Let's console.log our encoded key and our encoded value. Is everyone having this problem with the sound not being with the video? Is the problem from my side, or? You don't have an issue? Okay. I'll go ahead. Okay, good. I'll continue then. So let's display our encoded key and our encoded value then. Let's see, what time is it? And we'll see that since it doesn't like the 2 points, it has replaced the 2 points we have between the hours and the minutes with a percentage 3a. Like you can see here, it encoded it correctly in the value. So now that we have our encoded key and our encoded value, it's time to build our URL parameter. All we need to do here is, it's quite simple actually. We'll need to just join everything. We need to return, like we said, we need to build here an array. So we need to return something to put in the array, when we will return a string with the encoded key equals the encoded value. Because remember, we want to build here, we want to build this that we want to build. So this is the key and this is the value. What we're missing would be this, and we want, in case we send more than one parameter, we want to give this here. We want it to work if we send multiple parameters. So what we'll do is that for every pair we receive, we want it to be separated by this. So we created this, but we need to add the separator. So this will give us an array, but we need a string. So from this array, all we need to do is we add here dot join. Like you see, this creates a string from an array, and we need a separator, like what we want to use to separate every element of the array. So here we return this, and we want it to be separated by this. So all we have to do is add this symbol as a separator, and we are done. Let's look at our string. Let's see what we've done so far. Oops. Let's look. And we'll see that it is good to go. Time equal 12:54. Now we need to create the full array. This is the simplest part. All we need to do is have our window dot location. This accesses our browser's URL, our tab's URL, and we'll use href to give it a reference, and we'll use, we wanted to go to the page we built earlier. If you remember, the data.html page, So we'll go there, we'll go to data.html, we'll give it the interrogation mark, of course, because we want it to add the form URL encoded form data, and we'll put here the form data as a string. So here you'll see we have no inputs, but we should be able now to send to our page the correct time from the form data we've built here. So let's try this. See in the chat. So what time is it? So you'll see that it is working correctly. We get our time and we'll get the hours and minutes correctly. This is the time it is right now. So we are done with this. We've built our form data from JavaScript. We've created the date. We've added value to our form using append. We've extracted the entries from the form data, and we put it in a string where we encoded the key and value each time. And we sent it to our other page. So that's how we encode we do it manually from JavaScript. If you need to create your data in JavaScript and don't want it to go through the HTML, that's how we would do it. So we used both ways to manipulate and handle form data in this example. Do you have any questions? I'm trying to unmute Wajih. It doesn't seem to work.
Thank you for effort, teacher. I have a problem. I am applying as you, but when Harif remove to data.html, he make me error.
What kind of error? You're writing code in the same time as me?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the error you receive?
Your file could not be accessed.
Do you have a data.html? Did you create the file?
Yes, I have data.html.
All right. Can I don't know if you can share your screen so I can see what you have done, because I want to see your code. But can you say, did you write it on Code Sandbox? If you wrote it in Code Sandbox, you can share it here. You can write share and copy the link, and you can send it to me in the chat.
Okay.
So I can take a look. Oops. Are you able to share the link, Wajih, so we can see it, everyone? I can share. I can have it on my screen and fix the error.
Because the internet is weak, just a minute,
Okay.
please.
Okay, of course. In the meantime, I see in the chat that Muhammad, if I'm not mistaken, says it's too complicated. Do you have a question? You can raise your hand and I can clarify it if it seems too complicated for you, while Wajih sends us the link. No, you don't. No, you don't. It is just an example, so I can show you how to build a form data and URL encode it without relying on the HTML. It doesn't mean that you have to do this just for time. It is useful when you want, for example, when you're working for a client and you have a lot of data and you have a data that is coming from the server. You don't want to be putting it in inputs. It will be too complicated because you don't know what type of data you'll get. And if you want to modify it before sending it again, and you need to send it in form data, that's how you need to do it. This is just a small example in terms of sending data. There is another, we will further in the course, we'll see a simpler way to format data. But if you want to send URL encoded form data, that is the way to do it. Unfortunately, the browser makes it way simpler when we want to write HTML. If we want the time, we could have done it simply by injecting our time in an input and then sending it. We could have sent time directly. We could have, for example, if I could have just done this here, we could, if I do data directly here, we can inject the time. And we can have it here, for example, like this. To answer you, Muhammad, we can have this like this. Right, and we can have it like this. And we can inject it directly here by saying hours, minutes. We can definitely do that. And if I go here, let's say, let's give it anything. If you run this again, where is the data? I mean, data. Oh, it's because we give it here again. So let's take this and put it here. Before we display, let's put data again and use our injected time. We'll see you have injected. Oh, data equals. Excuse me, this will need to go here. You see my injected time will work. You can just do this, it's 3 lines. But what if you want to send it to another page? This is because it's in the same page. What if you want to get it from another source? What if you want to be getting the time from every client you have? For example, let's say you and I are both using the same solution and you want to send to your server in terms of form data. You want to send them Gaza time, and I want to send them Tunisia time from the client. We'll need to do that, unfortunately. It is not simply about displaying time. It's about how we can create our own form data and create our own URL encoding. That's it. And that may seem a bit complicated at first, I agree. Yasmin, you asked if I could go through the code again quickly. So let's do that. Like I said, there are 2 ways to build the form data. There is the simple way, which is the HTML way. We declare a form. We give it a method in which we want to send the form data. And we'll create an action, which will basically be the link where we'll be sending our URL encoded data, because we chose get. Here, we're going to be sending it to our own other HTML. But keep in mind here, you could have a server address to send the data. But we're sending it to our own file. So we have this it's just a label. We have our inputs. What's important is the input. Every input is going to count as a name, as a key value pair. Actually, every input. So here we have two inputs. This one doesn't count because it's a type of submit, but every other input except submit will count as a key value pair. So here we have created the first name and the last name key value pairs. First name Hazem, last name Miri. These are two pairs. That's what we have created. And then we went on to create our data.html where we wanted to display the received data. So thanks to this, we don't have to create our own form data. The browser creates it. We don't have to do anything. All you have to do is tell it where we want the data to be sent. And it's going to send it. So we went here and we know the data, we're going to receive data, but we needed to read it. We need to read it and do something with it. So we prepared it. We created div called data display with the ID data display, where we wanted to display all the URL encoded form data we receive. And we went on to write JavaScript to do just that. We started with an empty data. We started with a header in our HTML saying your data, but no data displayed. And we selected our element thanks to the ID. Like if you remember, we said we created here a div with the ID data display that we're getting here thanks to document.getElement by ID. So we're getting it by ID with the data display. After that, we need to start reading the URL. So we should have received this in the URL, data HTML, first name, last name. We should have received that. And we need to handle it. We need to read it. We need to take it and decompose it into something we can use. Because this doesn't mean much to us. We can do much with it in its current state. How we can do that? First, we need to get this. We get it thanks to the window.location.search, which will give us this, just this. That's what it will give us. And then we need to decompose it. And we decompose it thanks to this. This will basically give us first name alone and last name alone. So we don't have to go and search for this symbol, search for this symbol, and handle it ourselves. The browser does it for us. All we do is give it to a URL search params, and it will give us an object that we can use with our pairs. Then we'll inject it in our data, like we prepared here. We prepared here an empty object. We're going to inject the entries from the URL search params we just created directly into this data. So we'll have an object that we can use. And then we go through that object, we take every pair, every key, every value, and we add to our HTML here a paragraph, a simple paragraph. Like here, I forgot to add this to close the tag. We have an PHTML tag for paragraph. And every time we're going to have the key equal the value for every pair that we send. We have two pairs here, the first name, like I said, and the last name. And that's what we'll do. And this is a P tag, and this is another P tag that we have injected. Is that clearer for you, Yasmin, in this part?
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. All we did in the second part is do exactly this, but without the help of the form HTML tag. Because sometimes you can't rely on it. Like I said to Mohammed, sometimes you're creating your own data. You want to use data that is changing. You want to get data, for example, from some database, change it, and then send it back. And you can't rely on a form in the HTML. And what you do in that case is you need to create your form data and your URL encoding alone without the help of the HTML. And that's what we did in the second part. We went in, we created our new form data. We took data, here the date that we want to send. This is simply the data we want to send, it's just an example. We appended it to our form data. At this point, we have already form data. All that is missing is to create the URL to read like we did here. We need to create this. This needs to be created. And that's what we did. We went and took the entries from the form data, and we created a string where we encode every key, every value, and we join it with this symbol, like we did here, this symbol. That's what we did. We needed to construct this URL so that later on we can go here. Like here, you see, href /data@html and the format data string that we constructed here. That's what we did. We basically replaced what the HTML form did for us. We did it ourselves directly in JavaScript. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to go through before we move on to the next part? Okay, so let's move on. I'll send you all of this. It's all in Code Sandbox. The links are in the presentation. I'll send you the presentation. Like you see here, there is a link here. I got the code ready in advance, so I can put it in the presentation. So I'll send you the presentation. You should have all the working code that we went through now. And I'm recording the. Oh, Hamza. Let me unmute you. There.
Hi, Engineer Hazem. Can you go to the index.javascript?
Of course.
Index?
Of course. There we go.
Just the constant enters. Can you repeat the generation
here?
of this? Yeah.
This? Okay. This is how form data is encoded in its own way. Like we will talk later, excuse me, in other ways to encode data, but data in form data is not done like this. We are used to this notation that we'll actually explain more in detail later. We're used to this. Right? That's what we are used to. But form data doesn't use this. It doesn't use this format. It doesn't. It simply does. It's a full prototype that if you want, for example, to get first name, you need to do form data dot get first name, and that will give you Hazem. You can't simply do form data dot first name. That doesn't work. That gives you undefined. That simply doesn't work. So what we want to do is that we want to access these, but since get asks us to give it the key, we don't want to every time go to take the key. We could have, instead of doing this, we could have just simply said first name equal form data dot get, and we use here first name, and here we do the same thing. We could have done this.
It's like abbreviation.
Exactly. What I wanted to do is that in order to do this, you need to know all the keys, except you don't know them. What do you do? What do you do if you have a form data with 100 pairs? Are you going to write 100 lines every time with the form data.get? Are you going to do this like that for every pair you have? That is not practical. What entries does is that it gives you an array with all the pairs. That basically it will give you an array like this with every pair. It will give you, for example, here first name, the second pair, that is what it will give you. So you don't have, if you have 100, you will have 100 pairs ready. So you can then put them in your entries, and like I did, map through them or go in a for loop or use whatever you want to go through every entry. You can use a for loop here, for example, if you like it better. I used map because it's easier than I do the join, and it just gives me the string I want. Because that's what I wanted to do. But you can go and do for var e equals 0, e inferior to entries dot length, etc. That's what I could have done as well. But it is here so I can handle even 100 pairs easily. Basically, that's what it is for. If it's all clear, then let's move on to the next one.
Many thanks. It's clear.
Okay, good. I'm happy it's clearer for you. Okay. Let's get back to the audio turned off. Do you hear me now? You don't hear me? Someone is saying the audio turned off. Can anyone hear me? Okay. You seem to be having a problem. Muaz? Maybe log out and log in again. It's weird. Okay. Okay. Let's continue then with the lesson plan. We've seen the form data. We've written it in terms of code. But like we said earlier, there is a notation that maybe you are used to more and which is easier to understand, which is Json. That maybe you started talking about with Mr. Safed. Will we go through it again quickly? So what is Json? Json is basically the JavaScript object notation. It is a language that we use for text data exchange. Like form data is another exchange language. XML is another exchange language. We can exchange it in multiple forms. Json is the JavaScript object notation, and it's a lightweight language, which is used a lot, even outside of JavaScript. Even if you use Python or use .NET, there is always a way to read JSONs. JSON is a very, very spread data exchange language. Like a lot of people use it even in production and in big companies. So the form of software side, this format and generates analyzed fast and easily. It's easy to go through. Even for in terms of software, the pairs are clear. We have the key, the value, the key, the value, the key, the value. It accepts strings, it accepts numbers, it accepts booleans, it also accepts null, and it accepts other nested objects in it, as well as arrays. What makes it also very good is that even for humans like us, we are not software, it is easy to read. You can look at it and guess immediately what it is. Like we said earlier, for example, for form data, it's very hard to read for a human. We need to use entries, we need to format it. It's not very readable for us humans when it's encoded. In text as well, if we go back to our exercise, this is not easy to read for a human. This is, especially if you have 100 pairs, this can get very complicated to read. What the advantage of Json is that it remains always simple, no matter how many pairs you have. It's easy to read, it's easy to go through. It has a clear syntax that is based on a tree structure, like you can see here. For example, you can have an object, in it you have another object, like branching out like a tree. So it is also considered a MIME type. So we'd like to quickly talk about what a MIME type is. A MIME type is also called a media type. What is a media? A media is basically content that can be consumed on the internet. We have multiple media types. We have PDFs, we have JPEGs, we have, in terms of images, we have MP4 in terms of video, we have docx in terms of documents, .txt and text. We have a lot of media types and a lot of formats we can use to send data across the internet. And it is an identifier. It is in the internet. We identify these types with an identifier that is divided in two parts. And when, for example, you are writing code, you want to send something to your server. Let's say you have a file that you want to send. You want to explain to your server that it's receiving, for example, a PDF file. You need to send a header, like you sent the method that we discussed earlier. You need to send a header explaining the content type. Like you can see here, when in an HTTP request, for example, in this example, for example, if we wanted to send the forum data that we created earlier, we want to send it to a server. We need to, in the HTTP request, add a header called the content type, where we'd say, this comes from an application, and it's XWW form that is URL encoded. That is the header. That is the content type that we use. We use a form data and it's URL encoded. If you wanted to send a PDF, it will be file/PDF. If we wanted to see, if we want to send JSON, we'll have application.json in the content type, as we can see here. That's what we would have. Excuse me, I'm gonna drink some water. So that's how we would communicate with the server in terms of HTTP. We need to define what we're sending to it. So on the server side, when we're writing code later and the more advanced courses, we can know what we are expecting to receive. We don't read URL encoded from data the same way you read JSON. So that's what MIME types are. Why use JSON when we can use form data? We learned form data, right? So why choose one or the other? Form data is really good for simple data, like we did earlier. Let's say you want to log in a user. You want to send only the email and the password. It is way easier to do it with a form and rely on the HTTP than anything else. But some of you have noticed that when I want to create it in JavaScript and send it, it becomes too complicated. Like Mohammed said, it is too complicated. Why do I have to do all this just to send time? Why do I have to manipulate my form data alone? Form data can be a bit tricky to manipulate on your own. It is a bit complicated. So when you want to handle data on your own, JSON is a simpler way to do it. But there is another advantage to JSON. It's not just that it's simpler and when we want to use it in JavaScript. After all, it's the JavaScript object notation. It's also slightly more powerful than form data because we can send what we call nested data. What is nested data? Earlier, we sent the first name and the last name in the form data. But let's say we wanted to structure it different. Let's say we want to have a full object called person with a key. Let's say my value is a whole object. Earlier, we have a key that is a string and a value that is a string as well. What if I want to have my value as an object? I can't simply write, for example, here, I can't simply write person equal first name. This doesn't work. I can't URL encode this. This can't happen. So form data can't handle data inside other data. That's what we call nested. For JSON, it's easy. You write person and the object containing the person. So that's why it can be also a bit more powerful than form data when, especially we want to handle nested data like we're doing here. That's what JSONs are good for. It's good also for displaying arrays, which can be complicated on with form data as well. I wanted to explain this because I figured that it may seem complicated to use form data, like Mohammed remarked earlier. So Mohammed, in the real world, you would use JSON for this use case. that makes it easier, I guess. Like to talk about data binding. JSON, I wanted to go through it just, so you can, you're used to using it. Basically, JSONs is what you use usually. So I think you went through it efficiently with Mr. Safedi already. We won't be writing code for JSON, but we'll be definitely writing code for the next part as it's important and a bit more complicated. Bear with me because this part can be a bit complex, and it is a bit complex. So what is data binding? Data binding is the whole concept for which originally JavaScript frameworks became more popular. A few years ago, when AngularJS started, when the first version of AngularJS came out, everyone loved it because it had simple data binding. Data binding is the concept of synchronization of a value between two interfaces. What does it mean? Let's say, for example, me and you guys open a web page. Together, we open a web page, and I want whatever I write to be displayed on your pages as well. How can that be done? How can we synchronize all of our web pages? How can that is called that concept of synchronization is called data binding, because you bind data together. It's bound. Every instance of the data is bound. So in practice, that means that there is a control value somewhere we store the value that we all share, and all of us can be called views. In a simpler way, we can say that the control value is, for example, a variable, and we can have a header tag in the HTML that reads from that variable. But everyone needs to share that variable. Everyone use views, and this is called a model to view relationship. And it's a whole thing in software when you structure, especially when we go for the servers, there is a whole concept of how we can do that in services called MVC. For example, we have the model, the view, the controller that changes the model. It's a whole concept. Let's not overcomplicate it right now. All you need to know at this point is that data binding is when I want data to be synchronized between 2 points. I want the same data between 2 points. It is used to, its purpose is to facilitate and automate the transfer of information. And that can happen in 2 ways. That can happen a single way, which means my model sends data to the view and that's it. But that can be 2-way, which means the model sends data to the view and the view can send updates to the model that the model can then share with other views. That's called 2-way data binding. We'll go through it one by one. 1-way data binding. 1-way data binding is, like we said, is that when we want to bind some piece of data to something on the view, and when the data changes, I want the view to change. That means it's a read-only data. It is read, but it's not updated. If you remember at the start of the course, we talked about Crude operations. This is a read-only operation. No creation, no update, no delete. It's a read-only operation. And that's called the 1-way data binding. So we have the data and we want it to be displayed and synchronized on our view. We'll start with this example, and we'll go forward to a more complex 2-way data binding. So I suggest we go back to our code sandbox. So we can start a new sandbox where I can show you a simple, it's not that simple, but a simple implementation of 1-way data binding and how we can bind data. So let's start a new sandbox. Again, a static HTML5 sandbox. Let's get rid of the code we don't use. And start clean. So what do I want to do here exactly? Let's think here. What I want to do is basically we want to create create our view. Like we said, we have a model and the view. So we'll start with the view. We'll have here, and we'll call this. We'll have this h2. We have no data at the moment, and we'll call this bound view. We call this the bound view. we have nothing to put here. It's like this is the extent for HTML. We're not going to write anything else in the HTML. We're just going to call our script and that's it. Everything will be done in JavaScript. This time we're going to go full JavaScript. No HTML involved. So let's call our JavaScript and create our new file, which will be the index.js. Okay. Now that we are here, what do we want to do? First of all, we want to bind the element. We want the data. Let's say we have this. Excuse me. So we have our object. We have this object with we have the property called, I don't know, anything. You can call it A, and A takes 123. Let's say here. Okay. We have this object here. And we want our element as well. Let's take our element. We have here my element. And we'll go use document.getElementById. And we called it bound view. Okay. Now what we want to do is we're going to have an example, which is we're going to do my element.inner HTML equal obj.a. And that what that will do is that it will display 123. The thing is, here, Code Sandbox will refresh our page instantly if we change here. For example, if we do obj.a equal 465, it will change it because it refreshes automatically the page. But in real world, I'm going to see if I can disable that. 1 second. Excuse me for just 1 second, because for this example, I'd like to disable the auto refresh of Code Sandbox. Okay, so we should be able to do this here. Like I said, let's go to preferences and preview on edits. Let's check that off. Okay, now if I do this here, excuse me, preferences, preview. Let's disable the preview here, and it should now work. If I go, yes, it doesn't. Unfortunately, it keeps changing the preview. Unfortunately, that's too bad. I wanted to disable it so I can show you why we need the data binding. But no matter. Let's try it here. Okay. Let's get back to it, and unfortunately I can't find a way to disable it because it reloads the page. Normally in your browser it won't do that. In your browser normally it would simply tell you that it won't change. Basically you need to refresh the page every time you click here. Refresh, so the value changes. Data binding helps you change the value without refreshing the page. So without refresh, for example, if you used Facebook a long time ago, when you received a new message on Facebook, you used to need to refresh the page to display the new messages, but now it just displays in real time, and that's what data binding is. So here, let's assume it doesn't refresh for us and continue the exercise. So I need to be able to have the 123 become 32 without having to refresh the page, and that will become better, maybe clearer and two-way data binding when we can change it directly from the HTML. But now, for now, let's try to go step by step because it's a bit complex. So we'll create here a function that is called binding, and it's actually a prototype. Mr. Safadi taught you another way to declare prototype, which is newer, which is the class. You can declare a class called binding, but for the purpose of better understanding JavaScript, we're gonna maintain the original notation, which is the function prototype-oriented approach. Because in reality, when you write a class, what the browser does, it will convert it back to a function like we're writing now. So I think it's always useful to know how it is and what it looks like really in reality. So let's start. When we get binding, we need to start getting a parameter of what we want to bind. And let's see what we need. We want, instead here of doing object.a directly, we want to bind new binding. And what we'll need to bind, we'll need to bind our object. We're gonna give it the obj that we created here. This, we're gonna give it to our binding because that's where the data we want to bind is. We're gonna give it a property, which is A, because we want to tell it which property we want to bind exactly. We're talking about this property here. That's the data we want to bind. We want to bind A inside obj. We need to give it the view, the element that we'll use as a view. So let's give it element and give it my element. This is the view that it will bind the data to. And we'll need to give it an attribute, which means in which way I can display my bound data, like we did here. Here, what did we do? We did my element and we accessed the display data through .inner HTML. That's the property we use to display. In inputs, for example, we'd be not using inner HTML, we'd be using value. Okay, but in this example, in later example, we use inputs as well in two-way data binding. But for this example, we only need the inner HTML, and that's the attribute that we'll give here. We'll tell it it's inside the inner HTML. And of course, since we're binding, we don't need this anymore. This can go. Okay. And now let's see. We have all this data that we need. Now we need to create our function here to actually create the binding. And bear with me, as like I said, it may be a bit complicated as a concept, but it will be useful to understand. Keep in mind that in the future, when we'll be learning React, this will become way easier because most libraries and frameworks actually focus on simplifying this aspect. Like I said, that's a huge part of why AngularJS was very popular a few years ago, because it introduced simple data binding. Let's see how we can data bind without a library or framework though, so we can better understand how it works. We're gonna start with basically like we do in classes. When we generate a class, you write a constructor. Like we said here, we want to understand how it works without the class. So we'll be creating it this way. We'll be doing this dot element equal b dot element. That's basically our construction. We're gonna do this dot value equal this dot. We're gonna, excuse me, b dot object that we gave here, and b dot property that's going to access a, like that's why we gave the property here, so that we get it this way, the object, the property. So now the value is this b dot object of, and we get the key b dot property that we gave in here. We need the attributes. That we gave here, but we won't need the element, and we gave already the element, so we gave everything. So the value will be the object and the property. We inserted the element and we inserted the attribute. So this is our constructor part in the class. In terms of prototype function, we call this functional programming. That's how you do it. Instead of writing a class and a constructor, they do it this way. This is called functional programming, while classes is something that was used in object-oriented programming, which are two different types of writing code. Object-oriented programming was made popular by languages like Java, like C#, while functional programming is used by languages like Haskell and Elixir, for example, if that interests you, which are other programming languages. JavaScript being what we call a multi-paradigm language, it means we can write in multiple paradigms. We can write object-oriented and we can write function. You've written object-oriented with Mrs. Safedi, so now let's continue writing functional. So we'll need a getter and a setter, like you did in classes with a get and set. We'll write this with function programming style. So we'll create a function called this.value getter, and this will be a function, an arrow function to maintain. We use the arrow function here because we want to maintain this. For example, let me explain this part. I believe you went through it with Mr. Safedi, but I'll try to explain it again. If I use this here, it's okay. But this is a weird part. This may be a weird part of JavaScript related to scopes. But if I do this, if I don't use an arrow function, that is the major difference between an arrow function and not an arrow function. Equal function this dot value, it will say this is undefined. Why? Because actually the keyword function here creates a new scope. So we lose the original this that we had and the parent. That is lost because of the new scope we created here. That may be complex to understand, but basically what we would need to do if we wanted to maintain the old notation, an older JavaScript before ES6 and before arrow function, what we would do is we do this, we come here and create another variable called this equal this, and then we would use it like this here. And now it's okay. And that's arrow function makes it easier, so we don't have to write this and save your this somewhere, so it doesn't get lost. Otherwise, you lose it when you go inside the other function. So let's keep going with our exercise, with our value getter. So what our value getter will be doing is basically returning this dot value that we have here. it will give us the value. Like we said in data binding, we want to be getting the value constantly. Okay, so now we need the set as well. We call this dot value setter. We will use another arrow function. We get the value as a parameter. This is the update part, and we'll do this dot value equal value, and we'll call this dot element of this dot attribute. So basically what this will do is we'll access, this will be like doing my element dot inner HTML. Since we passed inner HTML as the attribute, and we passed my element as element here. So that will basically be the same thing. All right, and we'll give this our value so that it binds to the view in a sense. This is our setter. So now we need to define our object properties. That's how we put the getter and setter in place. Normally in classes, it's simpler, but in function programming, we'll be doing object dot define properties, property, and we need to give it which object. So b that will be taking the b dot object, which is basically this, the obj we received, because we want to add a new property to it. And we're gonna, as a second parameter, we're going to use the property. Basically, we're going to redefine every time the property A. Like we said, we want this to be updated. So we're going to define this property. We're going to do this object, this property, and what we want to define it. What do we want to add to it? What we want to add to it is a get, which is our getter, value getter. And we give it a set as well, which will be our value setter. All right. And we'll go b.object, b.property. So this will be basically obj.a. And we're going to give it this value as by default. Before it changes, we're going to give it the initial value. And we're going to do this dot element, this dot attribute, which will basically be, like we said earlier, my element dot inner HTML equivalent. And we're gonna put in this value. Basically, this is here just to have the initial default display before we set anything. And normally, this is it. It seems to have a bit of an issue. Why isn't it being displayed? Did I forget something? OBJ. Element. Should I give it something? Did I forget something? This value getter. Object the defined property. weird. Maybe I didn't say. Oh, okay. I didn't say. That's a bit stupid, but I just didn't save the file. Okay. Basically, that is it. Okay. We can here. This auto, like I said in the beginning, this auto refreshes, but like we'll see later on, if I change this, even if it didn't refresh the page, it would refresh automatically. For example, if I do this here, if, for example, I create a function here called function change, and I would like to have object.a equal 32, for example, and then I can add here a button called with ID changer, and I can here have change value, and I can add here document get element by ID, changer dot add event listener, and give it click and change. Basically, what that will do, you'll see here, I don't touch the inner HTML. I don't touch it again. I don't change it manually, and now it should, if I click, it changes directly the value. If I do it, for example, like this, I'll do 10 each time. You see, it is bound. The data is bound to my model. It changes alone. It changes no matter how many times I click, without me having to go and do document dot get element by ID, bound view, and go dot inner HTML and give it the new value. I don't have to do this. Normally, if my data wasn't bound, if I didn't have binding, if I didn't do the binding here, I'd have to do this every time I change a value. But thanks to the one-way data binding that we put in place, this doesn't have to be done. This has no benefit. Instead of doing classes, it is actually not related. Like to respond to your answer, Ibrahim, functional programming is the way in which JavaScript is written. What I'm trying to do is preparing you to be able to read and write a potential client's code, because they may not have written classes. Because, like I said, classes are not native to JavaScript. They are just been added on top. And actually, even the browser converts it back to a function before reading it. So not that classes are bad, they're actually very good, they're clearer. But in the real world, you won't always be able to use classes, because that kind of depends on your client as well. A future client, if you have already a code base to read, it won't always be a class. And that's what we're trying to prepare you for. We're trying to prepare you to be able to work on JavaScript in every way, even if your client doesn't use classes. And it's actually very common. In my career, I actually haven't seen, actually the majority weren't even classes. Our training in that's actually very interesting, Mahmoud. That's actually a very interesting question. That's actually a very good question. Why? Because actually in React, in last year, I believe, released a new version for functional components. So you can use both, but the recommended way, let's say nowadays, the modern way to write React is function-based, not class-based. Class-based is now considered to be the old version. Hooks can only work with functions. Like Yasmin said, and good point. I see that you have people quite knowledgeable about React already. That's good. Yes, indeed, function-based components are easier and better to understand. For me, it actually depends on the people, because like I said, classes were added to JavaScript to make it easier on people that come from an object-oriented background. Keep in mind that there are some engineers that worked all their life with Java, and Java uses classes. It's object-oriented. It only uses classes. So it made it hard for people coming from that background to learn JavaScript. So that's why they added in 2015 in the ES6 update the possibility to write classes in JavaScript. But JavaScript has existed for a long time, and classes were only added in 2015, which may seem like a long time ago since it was 6 years ago. But actually, like Yasmin said, hooks, which came out a few years ago, came out to replace React class components, because functions fundamentally are easier to work with when you don't have simple operations like I just want to, like simple CRUD operations. If I want, for example, to manipulate my DOM, if I want to click something and it changes the color of the screen or something, that's not a CRUD operation. And that's easier to do with functions. And classes are very important, but functional programming is very important too. And I'm trying to complement what you learned with Mr. Safedi with classes. I'm trying to complement it by trying to teach you functional approach. And that's why I'm trying not to use classes in these lessons. And in React, you'll probably learn both actually. But yeah, keep in mind that if you want to use modern hooks, you'll need to write functional components in React as well. You need to write functions and not classes in React as well if you want to benefit from hooks. Does that answer your question, Brahim? Supposing it does. No. Okay, I got no answer, but let's say صمت علامة الرضا. أستطيع التكلم بالعربية، ولكن كما قالوا عربيتي لا أتقنها كثيرا، لا أستعملها في حياتي اليومية، ولكن أستطيع التكلم وأستطيع فهم أسئلتكم إذا الإنجليزية كم تكون صعبة في بعض الحالات.
التونسي أفضل أنا بقول.
So لا في تونس لدينا لهجة تكون غريبة شوية قليلا لما نتكلم بالعربية. عربيتنا تبدلت فعلا، لدينا لهجة أن تكون غريبة في بعض الحالات. So let's continue. So that's what data binding, one-way data binding is. And it's used for, like we said, when we want to change, we want to bind data, we don't need to refresh, and we can update data without having to pass in an inner HTML each time. And we can use it. And a better example would be the two-way data binding, which would be more useful since we'll be able to change data across multiple views. Keep in mind that this is also something that we use to synchronize, like I said, multiple clients. So that's one-way data binding. Do you have any questions at this point other than Brahim's question? before we move into two-way data binding. Is everything clear? Okay. I thought we would have more questions because data binding took me a while. Yeah, probably yes. You'll need to practice to understand it better and do your own research. You'll see at the end of the lesson plan, I included resources you can check from documentation to help you understand better as well. Define property, yes, of course. Brahim, I can explain the defined property. The defined property is basically when you want to add a getter and a setter to an object, to an object property. In class-oriented programming, like in classes, that may be easier since you just write the get and set functions. But in functional programming, what you need to do, define property is just going to add these to this property. Basically, it's all it's saying is to get the value, use this dot value getter, and to set the value, use this dot value setter. Of course, you can have even like, I guess we can have a 5-minute break. We are still on track for the course. We actually have some time to spare. So yeah, we can take a 5-minute break so you can refresh and rest a bit. Let's see you back in 5 minutes. Okay. 10 or you would rather that 10 minutes. Let's say we meet back here at 4:10. Okay. Let's take it back at 4:10 p.m. So that gives you 8 minutes actually. So yeah, let's meet back then. Okay, Muhammad, I'll show you an example when everyone gets back from break. I'll show another example for getter and setters. That may be more clear. Hello. So once everyone is back from the break, we can start again. So we can move on to way data binding. I will keep in mind that 3 hours may be a bit long. So tomorrow we'll schedule a break in the middle of the session. So you can rest a bit in the middle of the lesson. So is everyone back? Can we move forward? Okay. Muhammad Mujahid. Okay. Let's start with the Muhammad Mujahid's request for another, let's say, example of a functional getter and setter. Good. Good. I see you guys are back. So like I said, I'll be starting with another example of getters and setters for Mujahid, and hopefully for some of you that still have trouble with the defined property function and how it works. All right. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Let's create another. Best way maybe is to create another file so I can explain in this file. Example. So in this file, I'm gonna just copy paste a class, like my class. It's gonna be simple. And for this class, and this is something you learned with Mrs. Safari, you'll have these, right? You have getter and foo setter, and you'll have oops, did I do something wrong here? Oh yeah, excuse me, that's right. Value, and I'll need to have this here. Foo this. I will have this dot foo bar. Expected token this dot foo. Okay. We have, excuse me, we have foo equal bar. I'm bit rusting with my classes, as you can see. So we'll have here with return foo, and here foo, and here we'd set this dot foo equal val. All right. Basically, that's how we'd write a getter and setter in a class. Simple enough. It's clear. You just need to declare the get and the set functions. That's about all you need to do, and it works. In terms of functional, though, if I wanted to do something similar, function, my function, that would be a bit different. I would need to basically, to write the same thing, I'll just do this dot foo equal bar. That's the same. And now I want to write a getter and a setter for foo, basically. What I need to do is write these functions. I'll need to have this dot foo getter equal this, and we'll do return this dot foo. Like this is the equivalent of this. these are the same. And I'll need to write a setter as well. This is foo setter equal return. Oh, this will need the value, and here we'll do. We don't need this. Oops. We don't need the return here, and we don't need it here neither. We'll go this dot foo equal val. This is basically the same thing. See, we've done literally the same thing, but outside of a class, we can't use these keywords get and set and the same name for our function. We need to define them as separate functions with their own names with no keyword. And what that means is that we need to handle how to tag them as a getter and a setter, because our code, even though we call them setter and getter, our code doesn't know this is a get function and it doesn't know this is a set function. In the class, this is made apparent thanks to these keywords that we use before the function that we can't use in the outside of the class. So, but basically what do we do to tag them is just tag the object. We go object dot define properties, and in this case we'll go this, and we'll do and we'll do foo, since this is the hour bar. And what we'll do next is we'll give it an object with the get and the set. So basically this will be this dot foo getter and set this dot foo setter. And basically that is the same thing. These two are literally the same. These are the same thing. Is that clearer for you guys about the define properties function? Does that make more sense? Okay. Well, that's basically what it is. It's just another way to write it without the class, without the help of the class. Well, that's why we need the defined properties, because we don't have these keywords, no more nor less. And it's relatively this. These two are relatively the same thing. Okay. So now I guess we'll move on to the next. How to use each one. What do you mean? How to use the getter and setter? I mean, you need to initiate. Okay. You need to initiate. Basically, you'll have const obj1, which will be a new new my class, and you'd have const obj2 equal new my function. And then you can do obj1 dot foo equal something, and j2 dot foo equal something else. Basically what that does is that it tags these. Since it is we're using an equal, basically this keyword in this here makes it so that when we use equal, it activates our set either here or here. But you can still use them quite simply, actually, just like this. Does that answer your question, Hossein? Partially. What part isn't clear to you in this? How can I clarify it first? Setter and getter in function, how to implement. We implement it like this. You use the defined properties. Maybe I'm not understanding your question, but you implement it by writing the foot setter function, the getter function, and then adding them to your object, which is going to be this, in this case, in this manner. Oh, okay. Object.define properties object is not part of my function. So basically, this can be executed from anywhere. Actually, I could literally do it like this. I could do, for example, yeah, it is a global. It is a static function. Object is a global API, and define properties is a static function. So it needs the object it's going to attach to. Like we use, for example, object.values. It changes the object you give it to. It doesn't return actually anything. It's a void function. It is a void function. What it does, it changes the object. For example, you have here this before defining its properties doesn't have the getter and setter. What it does is it's going to inject them in it. It's going to inject them there. It takes the object as a property. Why do you use this here? Is because this is refers to obj.1. Literally, we could be writing here obj1, so, but that won't be defined because we only define it when we initiate the class. That's why we use this. We just want our obj.1 to have these getter and setter. And how we do that is by passing this. This refers to obj1. And in this case, this refers to obj2. Okay? But literally, we could be calling this here. We could literally be take this out of here. And we could do something like this, even though it's less readable. We can do it like this and just put obj1 here and j1.fooGetter and obj1.fooSet. We could literally be doing this. Yes. That's why we use this. This defines the instance, the object that we created using the class. Found. This should not be here actually. This is the class, so it should be obj2 actually, because we use it with the function, not with the class. So you could literally have it here. But yeah, this defines the object. So we could take it out and define here, except it's way more readable, in my opinion, to have it inside your of your prototype. That way you don't have to bind it every time you create a new instance. Because if you do this, if you go and do an obj3, for example, you'll have to define it again. You'll have to do this once more. You'll have to do this again. Oops. This doesn't make much sense because every time you need to define it again. That's why we move it here. And instead of using obj, we use this because it defines that obj. Yeah, so we avoid this kind of redundancy. That way, we always have our setters and getters and don't have to each time define properties of each object again and again to have a getter and setter. Just makes more sense and it's easier to understand if you already understand the classes. So setters and footers are declared inside the class. Is that a bit clearer, maybe, Hamza? And Hussein? All right. I will share the recording. It's my first time recording with Zoom, to be honest, but it is recording since earlier, so I should be able to upload it later when the meeting is over. Hopefully, I don't have bad surprises with Zoom. But yeah, I should be able to get you the recording. Thank you for your time, Doha. Let's go forward since we don't have a lot of time remaining and we still have the two-way data binding to review. Okay, I hope this made functional programming with JavaScript a bit easier, since, like I said, we'd be using it with React, and it is not impossible that you'll have to use it with clients in the future, when hopefully you'll be getting a lot of them. That's what I hope. Okay, let's go back to the lesson and get back to presentation form. And we've seen the one-way data binding. We're going to return to the code soon. The roadmap of the course, for the course, we still have the two-way data binding now, and tomorrow we'll check form validation and DOM manipulation. Tomorrow we'll have form validation. We've seen forms. We've seen how to bind data from inputs and text that we'll continue to see now with the two-way data binding form. And tomorrow we'll validate that data and we'll try to manipulate. We have some basic DOM manipulation in preparation for React it will be used a lot with GSX. So you can get the basics of what it means. After this, we should be heading to... Yes, of course. I will share my code. Like I said, I'll share the presentation, and the presentation contains all links to the code I've been writing. I've prepared everything for you guys, and I've put it up in the presentation already. So you have access to the code and everything needed. And don't hesitate to send me messages on WhatsApp if you need to understand something that I may have not been clear with during your review. And tomorrow, I will be giving you an assignment at the end of tomorrow's course, so you can put some practice in this. I will try. Like I said, it's like my Arabic is kind of bad. It's way easier for me to express myself in English. So I don't know how good I will be at explaining in Arabic. It may be quite bad. But yeah, I'll try to explain in Arabic as much as it's possible for me. Okay. Two-way data binding. The approach to two-way data binding is the same as the one-way data binding that we've seen now. The difference is that we want our view not only to display the value that we bound, but also be able to change it, which in a way we've kind of done with the button in the previous example that we are using to change the data. But we want to have multiple views that can change and multiple views that can read. We want it to be some read-only views, some writing views, and all of them, I want them to be bound. So we'll be working with multiple elements on the DOM where the value can be changed or just displayed. And that will look a lot like what we already just did, but more optimized for multiple DOM elements. And we'll get into it right now in the code, so I can show you what I mean. But most of it will be will look like we just did actually. Donc سأحاول أفسر ما قلته بالعربية كذلك. two way data binding سيشبه كثيرا ما فعلناه بالone way data binding، ولكن سيختلف في معنى أنه يمكن أنه يغير الفاليو نتاع كل variable وليس يظهرها بس، سيغيرها ويريها. I know my Arabic is kind of bad. Bear with me. سامحوني، عربيتي أستطيع الفهم ولكن إنها ليست. Yeah, I think English is my English is better. I think my English is indeed better. I told you guys. I told you from the start. I told you from the start that my English would be better to understand, since my Arabic can be quite difficult to understand. I'm trying to see how I can actually see someone raise their hand. I'm trying to display. How can I have them? I can't seem to access. Why can't I access the? I want to give you guys. All right. I can't seem to find a way to unmute you. I show like. Okay. Unfortunately, I can't seem to be able to see who raised their hand. I've got a notification saying that someone wanted to unmute. I use Mozilla documentation a lot, since basically Mozilla started writing JavaScript, and they hold the how do I say it? The official documentation is maintained by Mozilla, so it's always a good source to get the latest changes in documentation, and anything that's related to JavaScript. MGN is always a great source. So yeah, most of the references you'll find in my presentation will be linked to Mozilla actually documentation. So let's get back to it. Like I said, two-way data binding. Let's start with that. Let's get started. We'll start a new sandbox. Let's try and go fast because we're kind of out of time. All right. We'll, as usual, delete the code that we are not using, and this should be it. Okay. What we want to do, we'll start with the HTML as usual. What we want to do here is a bit different from what we've done until now, in a sense where we'll have not only the, we'll have like earlier, we'll write a span with the of text, and we'll give it an ID that we'll call data binding view. We'll also, but this is like what we've done in the previous exercise, but now we'll need more elements in our view. We'll have inputs, more DOM elements to manipulate the data. We'll have data binding control, the first one. And we'll have another one that we'll call data binding control 2. All right. We'll, as usual, be using mostly JavaScript to handle this. So we'll call our JavaScript from index.js. The two-way data binding. It's exactly what we've done earlier, but how do I say this? Earlier, we had data coming from our variable to our HTML. That's the only binding that happened. Only one way. It went only one way. So data was being received, but not being updated. Like we talked in the first of the lesson about crude operations. We had the read, but no possibility to update. What we want to do is that for some elements, like in this example, we'll have the data binding control 1 and the data binding control 2, which will be able to update the model, which will in turn be read in the data binding view. So that's what two-way means. Two-way means it goes actually back and forth instead of just the DOM receiving information. We no longer will be only receiving, but also updating the information, and we want to being seen, being updated all across bound elements. We're gonna bind all these three elements that we've put in the HTML right now, and we want them to synchronize their data in real time. So two-way means that basically any of these two can also send updates, while this one can only read. So this is the second way. One way is read, another way is update. Two ways doing both. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's get started with our JavaScript. Then most of it will look like we just did. Won't change much, but we'll still have an OBJ. We'll still declare our OBJ. We'll still have a property that we'll call A, that will start at, I don't know, 0, for example. Doesn't matter. And now we need to have all the elements that we created here. We need to load them into our JavaScript. So we'll load them using their IDs. So we have my input element 1, which will get document.getElement by ID, and we'll get this. This one is my first input element, and I have a second one. So I'll load that here as well. I have the two here, and 2 here. So now I have loaded both of my control elements. I'll need to load this one as well, which we'll call my DOM element, for example. Doesn't matter, but we'll call this my DOM element. And we'll load it again with its own ID that we'll call data binding view. All right. We should be good. Now, this is our starting point. If you remember earlier, we wanted to bind. If I take from the previous example, for example, if I go to my previous code and load the binding, we'd have this. Let me go to grab it. If we used this like we used earlier, we'll see that we have a problem actually. Let me. Let's declare the binding here. We'll see we have a problem. Earlier we had one element that we bound. Now that we have multiple. So that poses me a kind of an issue because I can't do this in the same way, since also inputs don't use inner HTML, they use values. So what I'm going to do is get rid of this, and I'll show you how we'll solve this issue going forward. Let's start just with the object and the property for now, and go back to our binding function. What we'll do is that we'll start with declaring the element bindings as an empty array, which will basically contain these bindings, since we have multiple elements now. Like we said, we'll use an array to hold them all, to save whatever elements we need to bind to. And we'll initialize, like we did earlier, this dot value, which will be b.object, and b dot property. We'll also be writing our getter, like we did earlier, as an arrow function. And we'll be having this dot return this dot value, and this will be our binding basically. Okay, so now we still have the setter to do. Dot value setter, and this will be interesting because it will change a bit from what we previously did. We'll still do this dot value equal val like we did earlier, but we'll also need to go through earlier. What we did is we came here and we injected, if you remember, I'll load it back up so you can see. Earlier we did this. Wait a second. Earlier we did this. This is not doable for us now because we don't have a single element. We can't just inject my element in an HTML and inject the value. We need to do it for every bound element we have here. We haven't populated the array yet. We'll get to that. But let's say we have our elements here. How do we want to set them all here? Basically, what we'll do is we'll create a loop. We'll loop through. We'll get a for loop. And the array will be this dot element bindings. And we're going to start here with the binding, my single binding, which will be this dot element bindings with the index of the loop, which will take every single one. That's our starting point. And then we'll do exactly what we did in the other course. I'll actually load it. And we did this, and basically we're going to transform that. We're changing this with the binding this time, because we're not using a single one. And it will have binding here as well. And what we'll do is basically for every one of these that we add to our binding system, every time we set the value, we'll go and update the display on all of these, one by one. And that's our set. Now we need to, like we did earlier, we need to add our define properties object. We need to go and object the define property, so we can put our setter and object like we did earlier. We'll define property, and we'll have b.obj with .object, and we'll have b.define dot property, exactly like we did earlier. Nothing changed. And we'll have to get this dot value getter, and the set, which will be this dot value setter. That way, we're done with the setting and getters. All that is remaining to do for us now is to add all of these in this array, in this element binding. So how are we going to do this? We're going to we're going to create a new function called this dot add binding, which is going to be to function in this prototype. It's a static function that you're going to call add binding, which takes basically what we removed from here, which are the element and the attribute. We're going to have the element and the attribute, but also we're going to add something we didn't have because we had only one-way data binding, and this is what will help with our two-way data binding. If you remember earlier, we wanted to simulate a second-way data binding. We created an event listener on a button so we can trigger a change. We're going to do the same thing, but we want this change to happen every time someone writes something in any of these inputs. So we need an event to hook to. We have an event in this input, which is going to be the onChange event. And we want every time that this event happens on one of our elements, we want it to change, to set a new value. So let's add event to our parameters because we'll need them. We'll definitely need them going forward. And basically, what we'll do is that we are going to create a new binding. And in this new binding, I'm going to create, and we're going to have element is the element, and the attribute is simply the attribute that we got in parameters. Like we said earlier, that's the element, that's what we used to have here in new binding. Now we're moving them here because we want to put them in an array. Now this is the binding we created. At event, I didn't put it here for a simple reason. Like I said, I wanted to exist on both of these, but the span can't do two-way data binding, so it will not send us data. So actually, I don't want to put it because sometimes I may not get an event attribute, depending if it's an input or not. So I won't put it in the initial binding. What I will do first is I will test if I have an event. If I'm getting an event, then I'm going to take the element and add an event listener. Event. And I'm going to take a function that takes that event to call E for this example. And what I'll do is that I'm going to keep calling it event to make maybe clearer. And what we're going to do is that every time there is this event, I'm going to trigger my setter with the element that attribute. Whenever there is an event, I'm going to basically come here and have that attribute have access. For example, for the input, it's going to be element is going to be my input, and attribute, as you'll see later, is going to be my value. So this will be getting the value from my input whenever there is an event happening in my input, but only if I get the event when doing this. And of course, well, the only remaining part here, it's like we need to bind as well the binding that we created earlier. Dot event needs to get the event as well because we didn't create it here, we didn't add it here. So we need to add it now here when the event is created. And all that remains is to push it in our array we're going to go to this .element bindings that we created here. You remember that we're looping through here in the value setter, this one. We need to fill that array. So we're going to push a new binding to it. So element attribute equal this value. So we're going also to, this is like we did earlier, and we're going to return this, of course. This is just to get the initial value that we did here, 0 to be displayed before we start making changes. This is just for the default value to be shown at the start. So now we created this function add binding, which seems good. Now we need to use add binding on these elements that we created, right? Because that's why we made add binding. So we're going to come to this new binding here, and we're going to do add binding, and we'll give it the element. So my input element 1. Our property, it's an input, so the property is going to be value. And the event that we want to trigger on is key up. Key up means that when your keyboard types something, and key up triggers when your finger gets off the key. So that's what the event we want to use to update and send updates to our binding. But we won't stop there. That's why we return this. Remember the return this here? We use it so we can chain. So this one, the function returns the object. So what is cool about doing that is I can literally add binding again and have it with my input element 2. And again, it's an input, so I'll want to trigger it on the value and on the key up. And again, I can chain add binding again for my DOM element, which will be using only one-way data binding this time. And on the inner HTML, excuse me, and no event, because it's a one-way data binding DOM element. Excuse me. So we should be getting here, like you see, 0, 0, 0, which is our initial value. And if my code is right, when I delete the 0, it should be deleted. And when I write, it should be bound to every element. So if these controls write anything, it is bound to everyone. And all I have to do if I want to bind another one is add another binding here. So that's two-way data binding. The first, the one on the right is still bound one way, which means it displays, but it can't do anything really. It can't send us data. But these two can change it. And when they change it, everyone gets the change in real time. Like I said, that is way easier to do with a library like React or Angular. But I believe it's important that we know how it works and that we know how to do it with only JavaScript, because that's the basis of any other framework. You can't possibly master a library if you don't master first the language it's written on. And that's how libraries manage data binding. We have 6 minutes left, so I suggest that we use that for questions. If anyone needs some clarifications or questions regarding what we just saw. Oh, okay. It depends actually regarding the contents of the full course. It depends on your chosen specialization. For those who chose the web specialization, you will go into everyone will learn React next. After this, next week we'll be starting on React after the assignment that I'll give you tomorrow. We'll be starting on the React course, which will be split between web courses with me and physical courses with Mr. Safedi. It's still the planning. I need to plan with Mr. Safedi to see who teaches at what time. But everyone will react. After that, depending on specialization, some of you will not be learning server programming, will not be learning Node Express, but will rather will be going to mobile and learn React Native for those who chose the mobile specialization. For those who chose the web full stack specialization, they will go into server development and learn Node.js, Express.js, and databases, mainly MySQL and MongoDB databases. Does that answer your question? Okay. So it depends on the specializations your guys chose. I don't know who chose what. But I know there are 2 specializations that you chose from the start. Yes, you will learn Node if you're in the full stack web specialization. You will learn everything on the server, while those who chose mobile will learn everything on mobile. For how to build for Android, how to build for iOS, and that kind of things. There is a lot to learn on mobile as well. So it really depends on where you want to specialize. So because like we won't have time to go through it all and the time accorded to us. But yeah, those of you who are into web will learn Node and Express and MongoDB and MySQL databases. So everything we saw today, basically Crude and everything are concepts in preparation of that. Firebase is not part of the web course, but I believe Firebase is part of the mobile roadmap for those who chose mobile. Yes, actually, when using a framework, the framework will handle most of what we saw, especially data binding. But it's important that you know how this works, because frameworks, if you have a bug in data binding, they won't really give you much details. You need to know how it works. I am actually on Discord. If some of you prefer Discord, I will give you my ID on the chat. This is my Discord ID. If you want to message me directly. Otherwise, I may create a Discord server and share the link with you if you guys like that. Yes, Firebase could be used in web to interact with data. Indeed, I use it as well. But when deciding the curriculum, it was decided that you will learn like how to handle databases, since Firebase basically allows you to bypass a server. When using Firebase, you don't really need much of a server going on, while we need you to be learning Express and everything. And it's better to learn databases in that regard rather than rely on Firebase. Because Firebase basically gets rid of all that. Yes, I can create a channel. Actually, I create a channel right now since everyone is here. Maybe that's easier. Okay. Let's add your group. Let's call it Go Digital. And I'll create the server and I'll send you the invite right away. This is I'll still send you everything on WhatsApp for now, the presentation and the recording. I'll upload it and send you the link as well. If there are any issues, I think I can go through Isra so she can give you everything that may be required. But I will send you everything we did today. There is no problem with that. And we can actually review it after you'll get an assignment to get, so you can get to practice it, and we can go from there and go into coaching hours if you need more help, even schedule one-on-ones. I believe that's a possibility as well. Of course, regarding the Discord server, I've sent you the link as well. For those who want to use Discord, I created the server quickly so I can send you the link now. So there it is. Don't hesitate to ask me questions on there or on WhatsApp. I'll be happy to answer you guys. And I encourage you to revise and look at more sources than one regarding what we saw today. I'd like to thank you all for your time. I believe that concludes our lesson. So like I said, tomorrow we'll be going through validating our forms and manipulating the DOM, and we'll explain you the assignment for next week. You're very welcome. I hope that my great Arabic wasn't a hindrance in your learning. But yeah, thank you for your patience. I see some Korean as well. Dude, I already déjà I struggle to express myself in Arabic, so Korean is maybe a lot for me.
خد راحتك يا هندسة، ايش ما بدك.
يعيشك يعيشك.
الله يبارك فيك.
Nice to meet you, Hasim.
Nice to meet you all. That was great, and have a great day, and see you tomorrow, guys. Goodbye.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
سلام.
يعيشك برقة.
يعيشك يعيشك.